Now to take our component and get it ready to be used in a widget, I want to do some refactoring effort. The first thing that I want to do is I want to create a type file that will hold the types that we're using in our component. That way we can share that types with other component. Create a type.tsx file, and inside, let's in our namespace, we're going to add two types. The first one is for coordinated data, so we can call it coordinated data, and that's going to hold our coordinates points, and we'll set it with an ID and with the latitude of type number and longitude also of type number. Then the second one we need is we're going to create a type for map object. So if you remember, we had this complicated, crazy type that we needed to use for the map feature. So if you look at our file and look at our map feature, let's find it. You see we have this complex format here that we need in order to cast our array. So what we can do is we can take this format and put the map array here, the map features. This way we have it, we can extract that. And now we can go back into our map and we can replace into the new type we created. Oops, types. Need to import the types and then call it map features, the map object. Okay, so that just made our code a little bit simpler. Then the next step is that if you see here, what we're doing is we're loading our map and we're loading the coordinates. So what we can do is we can get rid of all this code altogether and we can extract it into the parent component. And by doing it, we can share the data across multiple components. So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to add an interface and pass that data from the parent component. So let's create our interface and we'll call it I for interface WorldMap props. And we're going to hold a few things here. First, we need the map data. So that's just the type we just created with the map object. And we need to use the coordinates data. And we also set it in our type, right? The coordinate data. Then all those values that you see here, the scale, cx, cy, and initiate, we can extract all those properties, pass them from the parent component. So scale, cx, cy, and to initiate a component. Then another thing we can do is, if you remember, we're able to control the rotation speed, so we can also pass that to the parent component to make this component completely reusable. And now that everything is being set up, and we need to pass the prop into our WorldMap function component. So in our function component, let's just pass this new props, and we're getting tons of errors, so we just need to go through all those errors and fix them by pointing to the props. So if we look at the problem, see, it cannot find the data. So our data, this is going to be the coordinates data, so we can just call it props coordinate data. Then on the map data, hold on. Here, just complaining that we're not using all those errors that you see here is just complaining that we're defining props and we're not using them. So we don't care about that. We need to find all the other errors. So first of all, we can get rid of all those libraries that we're not using. So anything we're not using, we can delete. And let's find more errors. Okay. When we set our states, we need to set all those properties. So for example, for the rotation, we can use the prop that initiate the rotation. So we need to change this to props. For the scale, we're using the props. For the CX, we're using the props. For the CY, this is for the projection. When we create our projection, we're using CY. And for the and the rotation, it's using the state, so we're good. Then we need inside of our JSX code, we also need to point to the properties. So for the scale, we need to call the property. Everywhere you see scale, here too, scale. For the CX, CY, and scale for a circle, we need to set that up. And then for when we draw the coordinate data, those are the markers, we need to use the properties as well. So call that coordinate data. Let's save it, see if we get any more error, if I forget anything. Yeah, for the geographies, we can now use the map data. So let's change that everywhere. Okay. And save it. Our coordinate data, it's an array. It's not just one item. So if you look at the data we set, it's ID, latitude, and longitude of an array. So we need to set it as an array. And in our map data, we need to call the map features. So let's add that. And then we can call the length. So it's a little pain to make all these changes, but it's really going to help us extract everything and be able to architecture everything better. And then it gives us an error here on the data because every data type needs to be a longitude and latitude. So you can see it really, now the code is also more readable. So it needs to be passing an array. Actually, now they're split. So if you go back into that coordinate data object, now they're split. So what we need to do is we need to create an array and pass both of them, the longitude and latitude. And we need to do it for the other one as well, for the CY. So we need to create our coordinate data, which is the longitude and latitude. We got two more errors. We need to save. Sometimes it takes a couple of seconds to re-index. Then it's complaining the rotation speed is not being used because we haven't set it before. We baked the value, if you remember. So if we look at the map features, you could see here in the speed, we're mapping, we're baking the value of 0.1. So instead of baking the value, we can call the properties from the parent component. And that's it. All the errors are gone. I hope I didn't forget anything and it's all going to work. But all the errors are gone. Now our next step, now we have the types, we have our component refactored. Now the last step is we're going to go to the parent component app.tsx, and we'll load the data and pass everything to this component. Let's create two state to hold our map object and to hold our coordinate data. So we'll use React use state for that. We need the map data and to set the map data, and that's going to be we'll use the use state React hook, and inside we can set our type. Instead of the use state, we can use the type we just created. So let's use types, and the type is going to be map object, and we need to import the component types. We'll import that, okay, and then the initial value, we can actually pass the map features with an empty array. As an array, oops. So that's going to be our array value, our map features, and that needs to be an object. So let's wrap it around an object. Okay, here we go. Then for the collection, for the coordinate collection, let's create that. We'll create another constant. We'll call it, I can just use the name that we just set here so I don't have a typo. So if you look at the WorldMap component, we have the coordinates data. We can see what we're expecting. So we need to set the coordinate data so we can pass it. And we need to be able to set that because we're going to load that data. That's going to be of type use state as well. And the type is going to be the type we created. So we can pick up the types that coordinate data, and the initial value, we can pass an empty value, an empty array as our initial value. So now that we have the state, we can use effect hooks to load the data. And what we did before is we used D3 to fetch the JSON object and format it. And to make sure that it's not being called every time, we can use the coordinate data length and make sure that our length is not greater than, if the length is 0, meaning the data didn't load, then we can load our data. And what we're going to be using is, instead of using the D3 JSON, we're going to use the D3 queue, and the queue will defer downloading our data one by one, instead of because we need both the data at the same time before we're going to show our data. So a good way to do it is to use that queue from D3. I'm getting in an error on the length because we need to load, it needs to be a type of coordinate data array because it's multiple instances of the coordinate data for our markers. Okay, now it works. And now what we can do is we can create a constant that will hold the file names. And what we need to do is we need to create another file for the coordinate data. And that's what I've done. So if you look at the data, we have a coordinate CSV, and the coordinate CSV, I just took the array we had that held the longitude and latitude and the name, and I changed it to ID, latitude, and longitude. So we can use that instead of passing an array. This way it can be easier to manage, and if we need to hook it up to a server, a database, or anything we want, we can do that. So now that we have that, we can just point to those two files and create an array that will hold that. So it's going to be the data and then those two files. Doesn't matter which one goes first because they don't rely on each other. Okay, and now that we have the files named, we can start a queue with D3. So you can see you have here D3 queue, and then we can call defer, and we can point out the type of loader we're using. So we're using a JSON and we're using a CSV. So we use JSON for the map data, world map data. So we can just call the file names with our first element, and it's going to be of type JSON. And you can see if I look to import it, you see I have D3 request. That will do. And we need to do the same thing for the coordinate data. The only difference is that the coordinate data is CSV, it's not a JSON. So the way we do it, we just use the CSV request. Here we go. And that will load them, and then we can tell D3, hey, wait until both of them are loaded. And it takes a couple of arguments. It takes an error in case there's an error, and then it returns the first data, then the second data. And on the second data, we can specify both of them. We can specify the types. So the second data is going to be that CSV with the coordinate. So we can tell it, hey, it's a coordinate file. And then we can do our function here. And our function, we can check if we have an error. If we have an error, we can just give an error message. We can handle our error. I'm not really handling it. I'm just going to throw in a console log. And I'm just going to do Houston, we have a problem. And we're going to show the message. So I'm going to break silently. So I'm just showing you can put whatever you want to handle the errors. And then if there's no errors, what we can do is we can set our map data and set our coordinate. So for the map data state that we set, we need to set our map feature, and we need to pass on the format it using the feature, just like we did before. So we did feature, and then the data, and then the data dot objects dot countries. We need to import features. Okay, here we go. And this needs to be formatted. So we need to cast it first. We need to cast it to type feature collection, just like we did before. So to cast it to feature collection, we first need to cast it as unknown because it doesn't know the type. And then we can cast it as feature collection, and that's going to match what we had in the component before. And then we need to take the features element from that object. So we're good here. This is gonna give us the map data. Now for the coordinate, it's much more simpler. We just need to call the set coordinates data and just pass the second D2 value, and that will do it. There you go. Here I'm getting ES lint so we can suppress them because we're doing it purposely, the console. Now that we have our use effect set up, the next thing we need to do is we need to add the component. So let's add the component. It's of type WorldMap. And for the map data, we can bind it to the map data state we set. And for the coordinate data, we can map it also to our state that we set. So just map it to coordinate data. And then we have the other property, the scale. We have the CX, CY. So for the scale, let's keep it in 200 like we had before. The CY was 400 last time. The CX was 400. The CY was 150. The initial rotation, we rotated 50, so it's going to show North America. And the initial speed, we set it for 0.5. If you want, you can collapse all of this, so it's easier to read. But then now let's deal with any errors that comes up. I'm seeing 2 errors. It doesn't like here, doesn't recognize my type. Okay, because I forgot the array, so it needs to be of type array, the D2. Let's see if we get one more error. The imports needs to be fixed. So let's fix the imports. All right, we're ready to test. Let's see if we got any errors when we're testing. Let's check it out. Localhost. And it looks like we got an error. It doesn't look like it's loading it's not displaying the map. So let's take a look. It's not displaying the map because looks like the geographies are still mapped. You see, the geographies are still mapped to our state instead of to the prop. So let's get rid of the geographies, and we can get rid of the imports as well. And let's point out the map data instead of our component state. We can point it to the map data and call the map features. And now it's gonna point to our map features instead of the local. There you go. So you see, we visually we don't see any difference. It's all look the same, but in terms of the code, our code is now refactors. The data is extracted from the previous from the parents component and loaded straight into our WorldMap component and can be shared with the other components.